Now that we're done with the base coats, we can move on to the shadows and the highlights for the miniature. We'll start with the flesh tones, adding shadows and highlights. We're probably going to put in shadows with washes since this is going to be a high tabletop model. I don't have to do as much blending with a high tabletop model for it to look good in gameplay. I'll start off with my skin tones, Midland Flesh for my base color, and then Rin Flesh for my highlight. I concentrate with my Midland Flesh on areas that will receive the most light. The top of her arm, under her belly, on top of her knee, and then on her chest. On top of the other arm. I go back in with my cloth color and clean up any paint that I've painted outside of the lines with. And there on her mask as well. Now I use my Umbral Umber and I will line the edges of the flesh in the cloth. This helps establish a nice line that will make the two colors stand out. I also go back in with my Midland Flesh and paint another layer so I have a nice even coat. Here I'm doing some more lining on her arm. You can see the nice distinction between the two surfaces now. Just touching up the areas that I've already applied Midland Flesh to. And some more lining. Now I line the fingers. You can see how well it establishes all the small details. A little bit of the Midland Flesh under the fingers. And you can start to see all the details on the model. Again, I concentrate with the color to establish the light source. Now I move on to her face. I like to hit underneath the eyes where the cheekbones are. And then her nose and on her upper eyelid. That's where I'll concentrate my highlights. I'll also go in and fill in the eyes with the Umbral Umber. And later I'll paint in the color of the eyes. And then she's done. Now we'll move on to the Rin Flesh, which is one of our last highlights. I'll work in a smaller area than I did before with the Midland Flesh to get nice concentrated highlights. So the tips of the fingers, her upper arm, on her chest. And again, remember to work in smaller and smaller areas. You can start to really see the depth. Small areas again under the cheekbone and on the eyelid. And then on the bridge of the nose. Now that we've got our highlights down, we're going to go in with a wash for our shadows. I'll use an Umbral Umber. And I'll load my paintbrush with some water. You can see the consistency is almost like milk. So here I apply the wash. It's a controlled wash, so you're working in small areas. I go back in several times to get the darkness that I'd like to achieve. And then I go back in if I've made a mistake and I touch it up. Now I'm going to use the Menoth White highlight for my very last highlight on the flesh. You can see it's just a small amount on the eyelid. And then just under the cheekbone. And on the very edge of her nose. And again, on her fingers. And on her knee. And now she's done. Next we'll move on to the hair. I use a Thamar Black for my base coat. Then I go to a Greatcoat Gray, my second highlight, and then Underbelly Blue. I mix my paints together so I have a nice transition to work with when I'm painting. So I'll start off with the Thamar Black, and I'm just going to go in and put in some of my darkest shadows. It's really, really quick, just underneath the hair and by the headband. And then I'll move on to my Greatcoat Gray, and you can see there that I'm establishing my transition between my Underbelly Blue and my Greatcoat Gray, and then to white. So now I'm using the Greatcoat Gray mixed with a little bit of Underbelly Blue to really pick up those sections of hair. I'm going to go back in with a little bit more Underbelly Blue added to my Greatcoat Gray. I'm going to work in smaller areas again like I did for the flesh tones. And now I'm just using the Underbelly Blue to establish highlights. It seems a little brighter than I wanted, so I'm going to use a wash. I load my brush with some water. Here I want to show you guys about how much to mix in with my paint to create the wash. Again, it's about the consistency of milk when I'm finished. And I apply the wash all over the hair. Now that that's done, I'll let that dry and move on to my highlight. I concentrate on a smaller and smaller area with my highlights and work my way all the way up to white. Here I'm applying almost a straight white color to my highlights. And I think that looks good. We'll call it done. Now I'll move on to the headband. I use a Thamar black and a Crixbane highlight for the headband. It's pretty simple. So I'll start with a little bit of the Crixbane highlight mixed in to the Thamar black, and I'll work my way up to the Crixbane highlight at the edge there. And I make sure I leave a black line between the headband and the hair to establish the two areas. You can see I focus more and more at the top of the headband with the Crixbane highlight. And now it's finished. Now we'll move on to the clothes. I'll use a coal black and a sanguine base so I can get a nice dark purple. I'll mix the two together, as you can see here. And I get a nice deep purple that we're going to use as a wash for the clothes. I'll also use beaten purple and murderous magenta for my highlights. I mix the two together. I wanted a little bit more purple in with the magenta. And then I'll use a Midland Flesh to bring up those two colors. It makes it so the murderous magenta isn't too pink when I add the highlight. I'll start with a wash. Under her mask. Anywhere there are shadows. And on her legs, underneath. And I go back in a couple times with the wash so I can get a nice, good shadow. And here I have the murderous magenta, and I'm just simply repainting, going back over and establishing a nice base coat. Here again, with just a little bit of the Midland Flesh mixed in, so I can start to get that highlight. And on her belt. And I'll pick out the fine details with a lighter color. I'll use a very fine brush for this. It works best. And now I'll move on to the pants. And now I concentrate on the edge of her mask on the top. I'm adding a little bit more Midland Flesh, and you can see it's really bringing that highlight up. I'll concentrate on blending her mask. Make it appear as if her mouth is underneath, with a little bit of a shadow. Now I'll pick out the details on her little bow. Again with the Midland Flesh mixed with the murderous magenta. I'm coming back in and I'm applying more highlights on the pants. And I go back over it several times like I did with the flesh. And now it looks pretty good. Now we're going to move on to the sandals and the socks. I'll use a Menoth White highlight for the socks and a bootstrap leather for the shoes. I'll start off painting her itty bitty socks with the Menoth White. I mix a little bit of the Menoth White with my bootstrap leather, and then I'll come back in with just my Menoth White to make a nice highlight on the socks, like on her heel and on the tips of her toes. And now I use the bootstrap leather to outline the straps of her sandals and the edge of the sandals that are touching the ground. That's it for the highlights and shadows. Now we'll move on to the non-metallic metals.